Good afternoon. My name's Sarah Southey, and you've joined in today for the Resume and Cover Letter Development webinar hosted by Autism Ontario. Thank you, everyone at Autism Ontario, and especially Ola for putting this together and organizing this today. My name's Sarah Southey, and I will be walking you through the next hour talking about resumes and cover letters. Certainly there is a question feature that you're able to type in and ask any questions, and definitely ask them as we go along, and I'll get to them as I can because that's the best way to kind of get that more immediate feedback. And one of the bonuses of attending a live webinar is to have that engagement. I really appreciate it. It's kind of a bit strange just looking and talking at a screen, so certainly do not hesitate to ask your questions, okay? So firstly, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my background and where I'm from. So I'm just slipping to the next slide here. And I might need a little bit of help with that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so about the Red Path Center, that is the organization that I'm affiliated with. It's a private mental health organization. It does specialize in autism spectrum disorder, supporting people across the lifespan. So there are little people that come through the doors, and there are also seniors who come through the doors, and everybody in between. People looking for assessment, speech therapy, traditional therapies and counseling, behavior supports. So there we do offer psychological assessment and then counseling in those different capacities. And the office is located in downtown Toronto. However, there are affiliates throughout the province. Myself, I'm actually stationed out of Mississauga, and we even have an associate in British Columbia. Okay, next slide, please. A little bit about myself. So the reason why I do all this talking around work is because I used to do, I have done for about 12 years now, employment counseling. My undergraduate degree is in labor studies, so I studied work when I was in university. And then I did a master's in social work and focused that time in learning about autism spectrum disorder. And so over the last decade or so, I've been working around the world of work and autism spectrum disorder primarily. And I do counseling around anxiety management and social skills, social relationships as well. And then just personally, I'm a mom to young 3 boys, and I have a dog too. So that's a little bit about me. The agenda today, we'll be talking about the types of resumes that there are, what to include, resume do's and don'ts. There are a lot of those. And then we'll talk a little bit about writing a cover letter and some of the do's and don'ts that go along with that. Okay, so the types of resumes, you may have heard these words before. There's a few different types of resumes. You've got your chronological, you've got your functional, and you've got your combined types of resumes. For the purpose of today's webinar, we'll mostly be talking about the chronological style. If you want to flip to the next slide, it's an image. I'm not sure how clear it may be, but if you can just look at the points within it. Chronological, you typically list your most recent job first. And as I mentioned, this is the most common type of resume, and it's really important to note that it is typically most preferred by employers, because when an employer is looking at a resume briefly, if it's the most common type, then their eyes are most ready to scan it and look to the same places for the information that's important to them. So I've done all different kinds of resumes with people over the years. Sometimes we'll do a functional, and the functional would instead be describing of the different core skills that that person has and putting those as the highlighted area. And then the actual jobs would be kind of more less focal point for the eyes. And so that's good too. But what employers typically say is that they prefer the chronological. And I think that's truly just because it's easiest for them to figure out quickly where the information is that they're looking for. There's a statistic I heard a long time ago that I think is really interesting. And it's that when someone's looking at your resume, whether it's a human resource person or a manager, they're only looking at it for about 10 seconds the first time that they have a look at it. So that's a very small amount of time. Really, they're just having a quick scan to see the keywords. And the main things that are bulleted that are bolded are going to be the information that they see most. So it is important to decide what style of resume you're going to do. In terms of chronological, like I said, that's most recommended. Times where you would use functional would be if you don't have much work experience yet. So maybe if you're a high school student and you've done a volunteer position, but you want to kind of describe more about that volunteer position, you want to kind of break it down, tease it out a little bit, then in that circumstance, it would be appropriate to use a functional where you're focusing on the different skills as bulleted points that you would take away from that experience versus just listing it in one kind of section. And then a combination would be when you do some bits that are chronological and some bits that are functional, kind of hybrid, molding those two together. Next slide, please. Okay, so what to include in a resume. We're going to spend a fair bit of time on this over the next few slides, and I'm going to tell you the different sections, and then we're going to break down what goes on those different sections. And we're going to look at a number of examples today as well, so that you can get some practical context. Okay, so the types of, the things to include. Actually, can we go back to the previous slide for a moment? So the main categories. So what you're going to include is most definitely your contact information. And then you're going to have an objective or a summary and / profile. And so we're going to talk about the differences between those and what might be encouraged. And where I have the slashes, you'll see highlight or skills or qualification or skills. Those are different headings that you can use. It doesn't have to be one term versus the other. It's just those are the common words that might be associated with that heading. And then you're going to include your education, work experiences, volunteer experiences, awards and memberships and interests. And if I've got any academics on the webinar today, CV, a curriculum vitae, will be a bit different. In that situation, you're going to be also including a lot more about your academic achievements and different publications, that sort of thing, of course. So you might get a few tips out of this webinar if that's your situation, but definitely there'd be some different pieces around what to include in the level of detail. Okay, so going to contact information, next slide, please. You're gonna include your name, address, phone, and email. I have a lot of people not include their addresses anymore. And at the end of the day, it has to be a choice that you're comfortable with. So if you're uncomfortable with an employer knowing where you live, then that is obviously your choice, right? But I generally do suggest that you include an address if you can, because employers like to know that you're at least in the city that you're applying for work in. From kind of a logistical perspective, employers like to know that where you live so they know in advance that, yes, you can be relied on and accountable to get to work and that you have plans for commuting or transportation. Right now, that seems a little bit different because all work is remote and online, but generally that is still considered typical practice. If you didn't feel comfortable including your address, I would still at least suggest that you do include the city that you're living in as a piece. And if you don't have a consistent address, if you don't have a consistent email, you don't have a consistent phone number, then certainly connecting with supports in your community, like local employment resource centers, they can give you that information. So I know that I mentioned that I used to work in employment counseling more directly for different populations, I think. And when I did that at the John Howard Society, there would be some people who would be wanting to find work, but they didn't have a consistent phone number at that time. And so they were allowed to use the phone number at John Howard Society, and there was like a back line where when people called in, then whoever answered the phone knew that if it was coming from a certain line, they would just say hello, and they wouldn't say John Howard Society, so that the employer would not be taken back or confused why someone would be having a phone number connected to an organization. And so definitely the point of that is if you don't have a consistent address, phone, that sort of thing, then you can definitely, there are supports out there in the community that can help you with making sure that you do have something to put on your resume and a consistent point of contact. The other thing to mention is about emails. So are most of us who are participating today, do we all have professional emails, professional email addresses? And by that, I mean making sure that your email address would probably include your name and leave it at that. So I have had people apply for jobs and it's like butterflybaby69@hotmail.com. Unfortunately, that's not really a very professional email address, and that doesn't really exude your professionalism to an employer. So you do want to keep it simple, and ideally with your name in it is good, and with a major email service provider is also generally quite good, because that makes it just easier for the employer to contact you if it's a little bit more straightforward that way. And definitely if you are applying for jobs, most employers will contact by email first. That's the most common practice now with most industry around setting up an interview, scheduling time for next steps. So it is important, if you are going to be applying for jobs, that you are checking your email regularly. So make sure it's something that, before you put it on your resume, that you're logging in, checking the password, all those good pieces. And certainly if you have a relevant portfolio or a website, that would be another appropriate piece to put on the contact information too. So a lot of people that I work with who are exceptional creatives, who are in different design, animation, different art-based programs, or have studied those kinds of things, or just have great talents in those kinds of things and are looking for work in those industries, absolutely it would be appropriate to link a portfolio or a website. Again, though, remembering that if you are sharing it with an employer, that there is a difference between personal information and private information. So if you have a lot of writing, let's say that you're looking into a writing portfolio, making sure that the content that is on the writing portfolio are appropriate things to be sharing with an employer. For example, if you're writing and trying to show your writing samples, but they're highly political and you're not sure how that may go with an employer, because we know that talking about politics is sometimes a bit of a challenging subject in certain contexts. Maybe you would not want to share that portfolio entirely, or maybe you want to share just samples of that portfolio if you're kind of unsure about that. So that's a little bit about what to include. And what I would say is, the contact font should be slightly bigger and bolder than the rest. It is nice to make your name stand out a little bit. Make sure that contact information is bolded, is differentiated from the rest of the resume. We want to make sure that if somebody in the office is wearing glasses and may have not the best eyes, that they have no trouble figuring out how to contact you. Okay, next slide, please. Awesome. Oh, where did we go here? Okay. Okay, so the next category is objective or profile. So I say objective versus profile. I'm not sure if anyone knows the difference between those two pieces at all, or if anyone has them on their resumes right now. But objectives are traditional. So a job objective would be the line on your resume where you would say, it's a job objective, and you say currently seeking retail stock position. And sometimes people would say to gain experience in the industry. That's a pretty generic example of one. And I mentioned that they're often redundant, because when you're applying for a job, if you're applying for that position, so say you apply to a retail stock position in a couple months when things are back to normal, or a new normal, and you say that, then it's going to be a little bit confusing or it's going to be a little bit unnecessary, I guess, for the employer to see that, because certainly if you're applying to that job, they already know at that point that you're looking to gain experience in the retail industry in that position, because you would have been applying to that position. So that was kind of a traditional approach to do an objective, but certainly for the last long while, there has been a shift towards profiles or summaries about the person. And this is where you would kind of mention a little bit about who you are, and a little bit about your brand. This would be the time where you would talk about yourself and give a snapshot as to who you are in a few brief statements. So it would be where you can include a little bit about your career ambitions, what you're good at and what you're interested in. And it's appropriate. This is the only spot on the resume. I may come back and quiz you later, so listen close to this again. It is the only place on the resume where it's appropriate for you to write in first person and go ahead and use full sentences. Okay, you can do that here. Other places, other portions of the resume, it's primarily bullet points and not written in first person, but certainly for this portion, it's okay. And the only other thing that I would caution around this is that you don't want it to be more than about 6 lines in length at the absolute most. If it's any more than that, then that information should probably be in your cover letter, and you need to do some editing. That it's not meant to be a whole long-winded story. Okay, so just going to move on to the next slide. I'm going to give you an example. Okay, and my slides are working, so I was able to do that myself, so that's great. Okay, so around sample profile, what you'll see here, 2 things that you're going to see. The first thing you're going to see on this sample is that the person does have their name bolded, and it's quite a bit bigger at the top, so that's person standing out. And then they've got all their phone number, address, everything like we were already talking about. And then they have their professional profiles, personal profile section. So this person is describing, I'm an energetic, ambitious person who has developed a mature and responsible approach to any task that I undertake or situation that I am presented with. As a graduate with 3 years of experience in management, I am excellent in working with others to achieve a certain objective on time and with excellence. So the only thing I would say is that he does use excellence twice in this, excellent and excellence in the same sentence. So I would just kind of correct him there and try to suggest a different word choice. But I did want to share this example with you so that you had a sense of what it may look like and some of the things that it could include, and also where it would go on a resume. So that's an example of someone using a profile. Again, that's where, like I said, you're going to be doing any of your aspirations are good to kind of put in there, where you want to take things, as well as a few key points about yourself. And this person's quantifying some of their experience. So he's mentioning he's a graduate, and he's mentioning that he has 3 years of experience in management, quantifying your experience in that point, in that place. So giving a context to how many years you've been doing something, if you do have a few years doing something, would be very impressive to include there. Okay. So moving on to highlights or skills or qualifications. So you can call it whatever you want to call it. Maybe not anything, but any of these titles is good. And there's a number of other names for it as well, but these would be the most common ones. And this is a section where you list some of your soft skills or transferable skills. So this would be where you're including anything that's impressive to the employer that maybe doesn't fit into a specific job that you've completed before. So for example, if you have done a couple of accounting contracts, maybe doing some light accounting work, and mentioning but maybe you haven't had the chance to mention your languages within that because all your accounting work was in English, but maybe you wanted to let them know that you maybe applying to a place or anywhere really, and you want to let them know that you have French language as well as one of your skills and strengths. You're able to speak and write and you're fluent in French. Then what you could do is make sure that you include that under this section, because certainly that's very impressive. The employer would want to know that that's relevant information, but it's not listed anywhere else. So you would list that in that section. And you would also go through, as I mentioned, any transferable skills. So soft skills are things that, and transferable skills are things that are skills that you would have that would be applied to a number of different jobs. So they're not necessarily things that you would have done or learned in your last job. They could be skills that you used and applied in your last job, but they're not specific just to that. They're just things about yourself that are good, that are important to employers, the teamwork side of things, the communication pieces. Those are the things that you're definitely going to want to put in this section. And I'm going to give you a few examples in a moment, but I do want to draw you to the handouts for a moment. So in the handouts, the one that's going to help you most with figuring out what to include there is the skills and assessment worksheet. So that's a really good one to have a look at to help you figure out what may go there, because that's all about the soft skills. And if you're kind of not sure what to include as you're starting to think about writing your resume, then what might be a good thing to do would be to go if you can, if you have the time. One of the webinars that we did in this series was last week, and it was on identifying skills, career matching, and interests. And so you could go back through that webinar, or at least look at that last handout that I sent, and definitely pick up some more information about yourself, think through, have some good examples of some pieces of information that might be helpful for this component. Certainly you want to keep it between 3 to 7 bullet points. 7's a little bit much. No more than 7 absolutely for this section. And I'm going to go to the next slide now, and I'm going to give you some examples. So similar to the point that I made with the profile a few slides back, is quantifying experience wherever possible is really good. So the example 1 says 3 years experience and working in the blank industry. And then you're going on to mention the core bigger pieces about skills that you have, looking down a little bit, the hard worker, quick learner, and ability to assume responsibility. So these pieces are not things that you can really describe very well in many other places on your resume, but certainly are very appropriate to include in this portion. Like I said, the soft skills. Okay, so there's some examples for you, 2 separate. So I did example 1 and example 2. So those are just 2 completely separate examples. They don't relate to one another at all, or they're not meant to. They're just from different people, different examples entirely, but just a couple of different ways to kind of think about it. And as you'll see, they're written in bullet points, and that's kind of the lay of the land with those. So as we're going through, I'm just going to keep flipping forward to the next section, that sort of thing. But does anybody have any questions so far? Because if you do, feel free to type in. Okay. So let's see here. Okay. Okay. So let's see. All right. The next slide we've got is experience. So this is kind of the bread and butter. This is the main part. And if you don't have any experience, we're going to talk about that today too a little bit. This section should include information about any previous jobs that you've had and employment dates. So when we look at employment dates, the employer wants to know generally the month and the year in most situations. If you've been in positions for a long time or kind of more senior, then you may not include the month, but generally the month and the year, as well as the list of responsibilities, the core things that you did in that job, skills that you learned and accomplishments that you had. And the best way to write it is to, of course, look at the job posting and make sure that the things that you're including are listed most relevantly and that you're highlighting the pieces that are most complementary to the job that you're applying for. And you can go as far back as about 10 years. You don't really want to go any further back than about 10 years. You can include odd jobs or babysitting. Any time that you've worked is really what you would include for this section. And volunteer experience might have a heading of its own, but if you are new to the world of work, you're going to just have one section. You're not going to probably split it up that much. If you haven't had any like paid work experience, then you wouldn't have you wouldn't put anything underneath this column. You would just probably have a column that says volunteer experience, or just experience would be fine too. And then you would list your volunteer pieces there. But generally, I would say if you can, break it up. If you have a handful of professional paid experience and also volunteer experience, generally keep those in 2 separate categories if you have the ability to do that. And then you're going to use the same tense throughout. So what's generally recommended is to describe your things that you've done in past tense. Okay, so when we pull up an example shortly, I'm going to go through a few more slides and I'm going to pull up an example and just reiterate that fact with the example in front of me. And as I mentioned a couple times now, quantifying your experience is always a good thing. So another example of this, we've used the example a couple times now of somebody saying that they had 3 years experience in the industry. Where I like to take things even further is, let's say that you're somebody who was a camp counselor at one point in time and you worked at a summer camp. As opposed to saying something like looked after children and provided meaningful activities for them on a daily basis, you could say something along the lines of supported 6 campers between the ages of 6 to 8 years old in daily activities. And that's going to make you stand out a little bit more, because all of a sudden the employer knows a heck of a lot more about you. They know exactly, whoa, 6 kids, 6 to 8 years old, and you're responsible for them. That's a lot of people to manage, and that's a lot of little people to be managing and keeping safe. So the more that you can contextualize that, the more you can quantify and give detail, the more that the employer is going to know about you and be impressed by you, hopefully. And if somebody else applying has a similar experience, also worked at a summer camp, well, hopefully you've demonstrated that you kind of stand out a little bit more than they might, because you've gone ahead and described things in a bit more detail. Okay, moving on. So education, and I just want to clarify here that with education, depending on your position, depending on what you're applying for, you may put this earlier in your resume. You may put this above the experience component. So typically people will go ahead and do their title, their contact info, and then they'll do their profile, and then they will do their highlights and list their soft skills, and then they'll either do their education or their experience, depending on what makes sense for where they're at in their career. That would be either one of those would be interchangeable. Either category would be appropriate. If your education is very related to the position, then and required for the position. So I'm a social worker. If I'm applying for a job that requires a master's of social work, then I'm going to put that right under. I'm going to put that before my employment experience type thing. But if it's not related or not required for the job, or if your education's kind of spotty and you've taken some courses and then kind of stopped and took something else, or if you didn't finish, which is okay, but it's just not the main thing. If your experience is stronger, then you want to highlight that more first. So with education, similar to how you would approach your experience, you're going to go chronological. You're going to list your most recent education first. And then something I help people with, and I always seem to run into this when I'm making resume corrections and supporting people in editing and revising, is that what's most important is you want to bold the name of the program. You want to bold what it is that you studied. So if it's your Ontario Secondary School diploma that you finished, that's a lot more important for the employer to see that information bolded than see that you went to Arundel Secondary School. They don't really care where you went for the most part. It's much more important to say what you studied and where you studied as opposed to where you studied it. So if you did a degree in labor studies at Brock University, don't highlight Brock University, highlight the labor studies. Okay, and then you do want to include the date that you finished the program, or if it's still in progress, note that. And if you're in college or university, or you finished college or university, any relevant coursework can sometimes be really helpful, especially if you're just kind of starting to transition to a more professional type of work than what you may have been working in the past, and you're a recent grad. Sometimes your coursework, sometimes your major projects, any theses can be really relevant. So that's where you would include that. If you received any awards, those are good to put there too. And a lot of people who are doing certificates or coursework, you can include those there. You can also have another category somewhere else around professional development if you think that that's more appropriate. But if it is relevant, then you can just include that right under education. And I've been mentioning this in all the other presentations that I've done recently. We're talking about resume building today, so I'm really happy that we've got a bunch of people tuned in wanting to refine their resumes, make them stronger, or write a first resume. But I wanted to mention that while you are in the midst of this challenging time where we're at home and we don't know when regular work is resuming, that if you're in a position where you're not seeing jobs posted as much as you might usually, then you might want to work on doing some coursework in the short term. And there's a number of different websites where you can access different courses and trainings. One that I was mentioning a few times recently was Udemy, and it's very cost effective and a place where you can build up skills so that you have more content to put on your resume. And I've also mentioned that colleges and universities have a good amount of continuing education too. So that would be some information for you on the education component. And then we'll keep moving forward. Okay, interests. So this is the last part of the resume we're going to be talking about today. So interests are where you would add some details that can diversify yourself. This is where you want to, show them that you are a human being, that you've got more interests than just the job. But we do want to keep them professional interests if we can, if they relate. But certainly you can list, some of your personal interests. We don't want to go more than 3 to 5. And it's only things that you want your employer to know about you. You have to think that they will be reading it. So what do you want them to know about you? So if they relate to your professional interests, it's even better. So the example would be, if you like reading and you're applying to a bookstore, then you definitely want to put that you're an avid reader, something like that. Okay. Oh, last one about actually what you include on the resume. So references. References is actually a really important, an important aspect of job searching. But on the resume, you don't need to include specific references. And you would probably use a sample statement of references are available upon request. So over the last decade or so, there's been kind of some back and forth ebbs and flows of what's appropriate for an employer in terms of contacting references, and what's expected of a future employee when they are trying to get prepared for work and submitting resumes. So my feedback to you today would be that when you know you're out job searching, when you know that you're going to be applying for jobs, it is good to try your very best to find 3 people who can attest to your awesome, amazing strengths and abilities. And the more professional those people are, the better. So not using your mom or dad, for example. But even if you work for an extended family member, that's okay. If you've done odd jobs for your neighbor, that's okay. Professors, teachers, those are all great people. So you don't have to specifically include your references on your resume, and I generally encourage you not to. But just because they're not on your resume, I want to make sure that there's no confusion that you still actually do need to have them. And I've worked too many times with people who have unfortunately not received a job at the end of the day because they either didn't have their references organized quickly enough, or they weren't able to secure references in the final moment. And that was a piece that kind of caused them not to get the job, unfortunately. So I like to encourage people to get on top of that right away. So as soon as you know you're job searching, think about who you can ask. Make sure you have their appropriate contact information. If they're someone who you knew a few years ago, it's sometimes difficult to find them. I know people will look other old contacts up and search them on LinkedIn, which is very appropriate, or dig out old email addresses or call a school, that sort of thing. That's all okay. And then definitely when you're actually interviewing, you want to let them know that you're at that stage and that they may be receiving a call from you soon. Or not a call from you, but a call from a future employer soon. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the resume sample. I'm going to view that, and then I'm going to share my screen with you. So give me one moment here. Okay, and I want to go to, let me just see. Sorry, guys, just one sec. Let's go. And I do that. Okay, sorry, took me just a moment there. Okay, now what you're going to see coming up is an example. Okay, and so this is an example. This was actually an example that I pulled from University of Toronto, their career services, and then I edited it a little bit, but that's where the source originally came from. And this person, their name is bolded a bit at the top. I would go a little bit more, even differentiate that a little bit further. But just in terms of organization, you're going to see they call it a summary of qualifications. That's the profile, qualifications, skills section there. We're not going to go through it in super extensive detail right now, but I just want to give you that visual context as to where the different pieces are located. They're going to go into education next, and then they're going to go ahead and list their related accounting experience, which would be most relevant. It looks like this person's from accounting. You'll see that there are, where your eyes are drawn, are probably to the bolded words. So some of the good things about this resume are that, as mentioned when we were talking about education, it's the Bachelor of Commerce that's kind of stands out in that section. They're highlighting the specific job title versus where the position was. So that's, again, you want to be doing that every time. And you'll see that under the accounting related experience, you're going to see that the dates are on the right-hand side and that the position title are on the left-hand side of the page. And that's quite typical. That's the most common approach. So I would encourage, for the most part, to express your information in that way. This is not a modern resume by any means. And there's some really cool things people are doing these days, especially if they're in design. And certainly I can encourage that. But I'm going more with the traditional because that's not appropriate for every industry. And this would be more what employers are used to looking at and how they can find information easily. Okay. And for this person, they're going on to, so they mention, they break it down and list their accounting experience, and then they go ahead and list their other experience that they have. They link their volunteer rate into their additional experience. And then the person also has a page number on the second page. Okay, that's really, really important. And they mention a little bit about interest, computer skills down here. You could also put those computer skills right up in the summary of qualifications if you didn't want to make it its own section. Now, I edited this a little bit from what it originally looked like. And what I would say, I'm just going to stop sharing this. Give me one sec. So I edited that originally. And I think it was on one page. And then when I cut and pasted, I want it to be a little bit bigger, that sort of thing, for the point of this discussion. But you want to, if it's close to only being one page, you want to keep it one page. If it's close to being 2 pages, then certainly you want to like draw that out. Okay, so I do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to take a moment on those before we get into a few of the resume do's and don'ts. Okay, so if we've done the same or a similar job as a short-term contract several times, how do we best list that on a resume? So that's a really good question. If that's the case, then what I would suggest is that if it's the same thing again and again, as opposed to just being repetitive and listing it, that would be one of those times where you could do a bit of a combination style of resume. So if you flip back a little bit later on and look at the combined style of resume, that would be where you're taking, what you do in that situation is you list the main components of skill that you had in those short-term contracts. And then you maybe if it's an admin, then you would list your administrative skills, and your communication skills. Maybe those are the top 2 skills that you had for both of those positions or for multiple positions. So you would list those skills under experience, relevant experience. And then what you would do is put employment experience as a separate category below. And then you would list where and when the dates are for that. So as opposed to writing it out several times, kind of being repetitive, you're just designing it a little bit differently. And then next question, do you ever work with people who have an education, or do you just help people write resumes when they have no education? So yeah, certainly. Like I work with people, I'm really lucky to work with people who are all over the spectrum and on the spectrum, right? So some people that I work with don't have high school. Some people that I work with have PhDs. And it's everywhere in between, because we know that if you met one person with autism, you met one person with autism, and different people struggle in different ways. So I can certainly help with individuals who may have different experiences and situations. Okay, so if you've done, okay, so we got that question already. Okay. So another question that I have that just came through is, do you recommend high school students entering the workforce and setting up a LinkedIn account? So this question actually kind of came up in a workshop last week as well. So if you're a high school student, it can be good to have LinkedIn if you're like about to graduate, you're maybe going on to further education, that sort of thing. That could be a good time to have it, to learn about other industries. Using it more as a learning tool. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for high school students, because there's not a lot of content to really put on at that point in time for many, unless they're like super involved with a lot of different volunteer experiences or employment experiences that are going in the direction of the long-term path that they want to pursue. But if the jobs and experiences are typically been more like babysitting and things that would be less professional, then I wouldn't suggest that it's absolutely necessary at that point in time. I would suggest waiting a little bit. Okay, and what do you recommend for individuals who don't have any references? So I've kind of spoke a little bit about references before. So that would be where I would suggest that you go out then and try to talk to, okay, any old teachers, any neighbor, can you help a neighbor do an odd job, that sort of thing, to get a reference? Is there any extended family member that you have helped in a professional way at all? References are important, and if you don't have any references and you can't get any references, you can't use any of the means that I've suggested, then I think that you can contextualize and tell an employer and script a little bit about what you'd want to say as to why you don't have any references. Maybe you haven't been involved in the community for some time, and this is a first go and you don't have any yet. And if you definitely can't figure out even one, then what I would suggest that you do is consider offering to the employer a possible work trial. Because if they can't validate from other people's experiences with you how awesome and amazing you are, then you may just need to show them how wonderful and how great you might be at the job by possibly doing like a shadowing kind of trial day where you'd be, if depending on the industry, able to do some of the job roles or tasks, or be on site for the day and kind of show how you might interact with some of your future colleagues. That sort of thing would be the best alternative, I think. And then the last one that I have that's come through so far, sorry about the backlog of all these questions at once, I wasn't seeing them. So this is, I've been told that employers won't even follow up with anyone who writes references available upon request. Do you know of anyone who has actually heard back from an employer after using this phrase? Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that's a myth. I think that if you're super worried about it and you have strong references, then you can include your references as a separate page, depending on how you're asked to apply for the position. A lot of applications, if they're online, will actually ask you to like kind of fill and cut and paste that information right into their application form, and it will ask up front, can they contact that person? But if you're worried about it at all, then go ahead and add them as an additional page. But generally, I would say that's a myth. It's been pretty typical to write available upon request for some time. So I would say go ahead and try it out, and I would not have any worries about them not contacting you because of that. Okay, so I'm going to also now just flip ahead to our resume do's and don'ts handout. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it because I do want to make sure that we have time to get to cover letters, but I'm going to just pull it up and then I'm going to share my screen again with you. Give me one moment, please. Okay. So... all right. Okay, and I've got my resume do's and don'ts here. So this is a good page to read through if you're updating a resume or editing a resume, writing a resume for the first time. I would suggest that you do go through this page, read through it for in its entirety, because there's a lot of funny little tips and tricks that a lot of people who aren't doing this all the time don't really know about. So some of the things I mentioned already, like the length, font, professional email. One interesting tip is that you do want to write your words out in full, so no abbreviations. That's typically more professional. If you will write out the words in full, so no Ontario, no aunt, you would write the whole word Ontario. You want to use strong action verbs. Use implied pronouns. So as opposed to saying I am proficient in 3 languages, you would say proficient in 3 languages. You remove the I am. We're going to talk about cover letters shortly. You do want to spell check and proofread. That's pretty obvious, but make sure that someone that you know does have a look over it. When I was starting in the employment counseling industry, I'll share a really bad example of something that I did. Was I accidentally had the word employment experience on my resume, which you have, but I had the accidental part was I had the letter Y missing from employment experience. So can you imagine? I looked at it 20 times or so, of course, and then somehow missed a Y, and that was the industry I was trying to get into. So that was really, really bad. That was not a great mistake, but everybody makes mistakes. That's life. We need to read them again and again and again, the resumes, and have other people look at them because you may not catch things. So that's basically, there's some don'ts in there as well. And I'd say definitely go through that later on. And that would be a good document for sure to have a deeper look at. Okay, so I'm going to flip ahead now, and we're going to talk about cover letters. So cover letters are really important for almost every job, I'm going to say now. I used to say don't worry about them as much for retail or restaurant service industry types of work, because at one point they weren't that common there. But every line of work is more and more competitive as time goes on, and certainly they will make you stand out. Now, there are some questions about cover letters and some resistance about cover letters that I find when I'm working with clients. Some people that I work with think, oh my goodness, I have to write a completely new one for every single job. The resumes typically are not changing very much, but the cover letter seems to change a little bit more. And that can make people feel less engaged in applying to jobs and make them feel like there's more work, more executive functioning, more planning, more organizing. And for a lot of people I work with, that is a little bit difficult. So a bit about cover letters. We'll go through a bit of a template so that you can have a sense of what you'd want to include. And maybe if you were nervous about cover letters before, maybe feel a little bit less apprehensive about them, maybe feel more confident in applying with cover letters in the future. So you want to be having a good, strong opening statement. Remember that with your cover letter and your resume, it's not bragging. It's just showing how awesome you are and being very clear about that you are an amazing candidate, right? They don't know you yet, the employer. They don't know these wonderful things that you've done. I know that a lot of people I work with struggle with confidence and esteem, but this is absolutely the place, as well as in the interview. Those are the places where you want to be doing that bit of bragging and doing that bit of really positive self-talk about things you've done and things that you want to do. And that's some of the hardest work, I know for sure, though. It's really difficult to present with confidence, especially if it doesn't come very naturally, especially if you're nervous and uncomfortable with the whole process. But I would encourage you to do your best with it. So be succinct with the cover letter, similar. You don't ever want to be more than a page. You do want to use consistent font that you use with the resume. And you want to share a few accomplishments so that the employer, it draws the employer to you even a little bit more. A bit of customization. So each time you're applying for a cover letter, you are changing who you're applying to, and just brief a little bit about it. But I'll get into exactly what that might be and as I pull up the next example here. But certainly you do want to customize a tiny bit. And the other piece where you'd be customizing, what you would be customizing is a little bit of information about the company. You'd be switching that up from job to job. Okay, so I'm going to get right into the example here and share my screen with you again. So I'm going to give you the template right now. Okay. All right, and okay, here we go. All right, so what I have that I am showing you now is the template for the cover letter. So this is what you would take and what you would adapt from time to time. So you'll notice that there's parts that are in brackets. And so that would be where you're going to switch the date each time, of course, and you're going to include as much information as you have about the manager in this section, about the person who's hiring, their address, that sort of thing. So you're going to change that up each time. Below that, you'll have a statement bolded saying what the position that you're applying for is. So again, for XX position, so you're going to change that each time. Then you're going to address it to the person if you can, if you have that contact person's name. And if you don't have a specific contact, then human resource committee would be appropriate. I wouldn't say to whom it may concern. I think that's a little bit more generic. So I would try to address it to somebody if you can. It might be appropriate to, even if you have a phone number for the place that's hiring, to call and ask who to address it to if you have that information available. Okay, then this cover letter goes on, and it's kind of like if you've ever remember writing essays in high school, where essays were like a sandwich, where the bun was the introduction and the bottom bun was the conclusion, and then in the middle is the meat or whatever. So that's kind of similar to that. So in this situation, what you'll see is this person mentions their name and that they're graduating from school. Then they mention a confident statement about themselves. So they would mention what position where they saw it first, but then they mention my academic and career goals align with the internship's stated objectives, and I am confident that I have the right skills for the job. So big confidence statement there. Then the middle bit, where we have a few bullets and a little bit of information. I'm not going to read it specifically, but what you'll see in that portion is that at that point, that person's taking their most related experience, whether it be education or work-related experience, and they're linking that to the position. Then the last bit, what you're going to see at the bottom, in the bottom two bits, and this is the bottom button now. The first part would generally be about the company. You're going to want to infuse something about the company here. So this person says blank company. Company name is an emerging leader in the educational software industry. So you're going to have to find something that you like about the company. You have to describe a reason why you're applying to that specific company. And that will take your whole application so much further, because the employer is then going to know, oh my goodness, they're super interested in this company. They're doing a lot of research on us. They really care. They're really engaged. And then the last little bit would be where you go ahead and just mention that you look forward to them contacting you, and you sign off. So not too crazy. You know, the general premise of the letter is pretty simple, but there are a few things that need to be changed and edited from time to time. So I can appreciate that people feel sometimes quite uncomfortable with that, or struggle with that. I would say try to get into the groove of it. Once you have your general base, I would write it just like that, where you have certain things that are either using X's or brackets or highlighting different areas, so that you know that each time when you use it, you're going back to that general template, and your eyes are drawn to the things that you need to change each time, so you don't forget. And when I usually work with people and they start using it, if they haven't before, once they do get into the groove of it, they're feeling pretty comfortable with it after they've done about 5 or so. So I know it's a lot to ask, but I would say try your best, try to do a bunch if you can, and then see how you feel after that. Okay, so we're winding down. We're getting near the end. I'd encourage, if you've got more questions at all, to definitely write in any questions. And then I'm just putting an ask out for that. And let's see here. So last bit, cover letter do's and don'ts. Explain why the company is a good company for a good fit for you. Kind of already went through that. And then I'm just going to, as I'm waiting for any final questions to come through here, I'm just going to draw your attention then also to the writing effective cover letters handout as well. So give me 1 sec. I'm going to share my screen with you again. Share. Okay. So how to write an effective cover letter. So this isn't exactly a template this time. This is just another handout for you, so that this might be easier for you to start to contextualize it a little bit more. It tells you a little bit about things that you should include and where you should include it. So the last one was a sample. This is just more telling you, just working through. So when you're writing a cover letter for the first time, if I were you, I would pull up both the sample as well as the descriptor here about where you're going to include what information and why. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm just going to flip back here. So all those are available in handout, and they're available in English and French. So lots of really relevant handouts to this presentation. Okay, so How do we address the letter if we don't know the hiring manager's preference, or in a field where assuming the manager's gender is unprofessional? Okay, so if we don't know who the hiring manager is, then you could just say, like, as you mentioned, refer to them as a hiring manager. So dear Human Resource Committee, dear hiring manager, and there, you wouldn't address it to a specific gender. And to be honest, we don't know unless we see in the professional e-signature or somewhere listed the personal pronouns that they use. Then you wouldn't address with the personal pronoun at all, just to be respectful and cautious. And then another great question that I have that has come in is, what if you don't have any experience? So if you don't have any experience, then we need to have you think about where you can be getting experience. That's a really important piece. As much experience as possible is good for you to learn more about what you like and what you don't like. And it's also good for you to include your learning and growth and professionalism and help employers want to take a chance on you. So things to do if you don't have any experience would be volunteering, right? So sometimes I'll work with people and they don't have any experience. Maybe they've had more intensive mental health issues for the last little while, and that's kind of either caused a big gap in experience for them, which I'm surprised this question hasn't come up at all. So I'll just kind of bring up this one right now. So it's, what if you don't have any experience, or what if there's a large gap in between your experiences? So many people who relate to autism spectrum disorder may also struggle with mental health for a number of different reasons. And maybe they're ASD, or maybe mental health, or maybe a combination of those factors may have caused them to not be able to seek out experience sooner. Or maybe they have a gap because they weren't able to work because they were attending group programs and group therapy, and things were challenging for a time, and now they're ready, but they weren't before. So in those situations, with some people that come in through my doors, or come in through my online, I guess now we're more virtual these days, what I will encourage people to do is volunteer if they don't have any experience at all. Find somewhere where you can volunteer for the next couple of months. Most volunteer commitments are a minimum of 3 months in length. So I'll have that person start to seek out volunteer work before they're even seeking out employment work. And that's a good thing, because then they're getting a reference. And we talked a bit more earlier about references and how important references might be in this process. So if you can volunteer somewhere for a couple of months, then you're getting a reference. And also, you can be job searching while you're volunteering, because jobs often don't come together that quickly. And I am not an economist, but I can certainly predict that it's going to take a little bit longer to find a job than it might typically take, given our current economic climate and global climate with COVID-19. So if you don't have any experience, try to volunteer somewhere so that you can get a reference, so that you can get some experience on your resume, and keep working, keep looking for work while you start to volunteer. And that's also going to be amazing to help you with your routine, help you with your getting used to going and communicating with people in different contexts than you may usually be used to. So certainly get out there and volunteer. Okay. What happens? So I have one more question here. What happens if a person needs employment and can't afford to volunteer, or don't simply want to volunteer? Okay. So depends very much on the industry that you are interested in seeking work in. Again, then if you don't have any experience, or you don't have any references that can attest to your experience, it may be difficult to convince the employer that you're the right candidate for the job if they have other people who have applied that maybe have that experience or have the positive references. So you're kind of not in your best leverage position. So that's where, again, I would go back to the possibility of asking the employer if you could do a job trial for a couple of days, show your ability to do that type of work, prove that to them. And then the other thing too in those situations is that if you can't afford to volunteer, or simply don't want to volunteer, then talking to local employment resource centers, or talking to different disability related programs in your community can be really, really helpful, because there are in a lot of government funded employment programs, there are people called job developers. And those are people who help individuals negotiate and manage with the employer when they're at that point where they're ready for work. And there'd be existing relationships where job developers might be able to vouch to a certain employer for you that you might be really good on the job. And sometimes in those situations too, there's additional government funding where the employer might be able to have a wage subsidy for working with somebody who has less experience or who might have had a rocky start in the past and had some challenges in previous work environments, right? So definitely volunteering is great if you can do it and it works for you. But if not, and you're trying to get a job and you don't have any experience, then definitely hooking up with a local employment resource center or something through Ontario Disability Support Program Employment Services, through a number of different adult channels, a number of different adult-related disability services are really wonderful to hook up with because they're going to be professionals in place that are there to help you bridge that gap, if that's the case. Okay, so we're at the hour mark here, and I don't see any other questions coming in. Certainly, if you have questions in the future, my website's available in the presentation, so you can reach out to me that way. We do have coming up next week, we're talking about interviews, and then the last week after that of the 5-part series, we'll be talking about being social at work. So I appreciate everybody tuning in today and taking the time to learn more about resumes and cover letters. Thank you for participating. And also a big thank you to Autism Ontario for hosting again. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you, having you tune in next week when we talk more about interview skills. Okay, thanks and take care. Bye now.